What do goats do when they get bored? Well, I didn't know, so I had to look it up. And what I found is that, among other things, they will often engage in risky behavior like climbing on unsafe structures, and they will sometimes bully other goats. Now in chess, there can only be one goat, who according to many people is Magnus Carlsen, and what does he do when he gets bored? Well, he engages in risky behavior like playing weird and bad openings with which he trolls and bullies his fellow grandmasters on the 64 squares. And that's exactly what we're going to see happen in today's game, played in March of this year, where Magnus takes down the young Super GM Jeffrey Shong with one knight to a3, aka the sodium attack. One of the worst opening moves you can possibly play, and it's an opening that Magnus doesn't even play well, as he ends up with a huge disadvantage of over 2 pawns before move 10. But does that matter when you're Magnus Carlsen? Not really. His ability to swindle his opponents right out of their hard-earned win is really unparalleled, and there's no better example than what you're about to see happen here. So let's get into it. This game is amazing. There's some highly instructive moments, some absolutely crazy variations. You're going to love it. The time control is blitz. Magnus Carlsen has team white, of course, and he begins this trolling travesty with knight to a3, the sodium attack, breaking 2 chess rules simultaneously, putting his knight on the rim for no good reason, and not controlling the center. Jeffrey responds with the most popular and probably the strongest move, e5, getting it in while he can. Magnus plays knight to c4, now moving a piece twice in the opening, which we're all taught in grade school, never to do without good cause. Now here it does come with an attack on the undefended e-pawn, but since black is able to defend with a useful developing move, knight to c6, white remains the inferior side. Jeffrey does not play his best move knight to c6 though, he instead pushes the pawn to e4, which Magnus now challenges again with d3, and after d5 from Jeffrey, we have knight to d2, attacking e4 a second time, knight to f6 defending, and now e3, opening a square for the other knight, which after knight to c6 goes to e2. And this brings us to an interesting position. Magnus has a setup that he could have potentially reached in only 4 moves instead of 6 by playing his knight directly to d2, instead of taking the long way around via h3 and c4. Play continues bishop to d6, and now we get a really poor move by Magnus, knight to g3. Okay, it looks like he wants to develop his light square bishop, but why the g3 square when you can put the knight to c3, where it's influencing more of the center and where it's not vulnerable to attack by h5 followed by h4? Well, all I can say is the mind of Magnus works in mysterious ways. Jeffrey responds with a strong and winning move, queen to e7, adding defense to the e4 pawn, which is now attacked thrice. Magnus captures there, and after d takes e4, he plays knight back to c4. So quite a journey that knight has taken, to a3, to c4, to d2, and now back to c4, giving a little tickle to the bishop on d6. And how would you respond as black? Jeffrey has 3 clearly winning options here. One is to simply castle, giving up the bishop pair to knight takes d6, when black's lead in development and space advantage should be more than enough to bring home the W, emphasis on should. He can also play bishop to c5, preserving his bishop pair, or he can play the engine's top choice, which is the utterly crushing bishop takes g3, and after h takes g3, a kingside castling. White's now got a damaged pawn structure, a cramped position, no quick way to complete his development. Rook to d8 is coming, attacking his queen, which can only go to e2, hemming in the light square bishop. So this is just positionally hopeless for white, and probably soon to be tactically hopeless as well. What's played in the game, though, is not one of black's 3 winning moves, but rather one of his 39 moves that throw away his entire winning advantage. Bishop to b4 check. This allows Magnus to get right back in the game with the move c3, giving his queen some squares with an attack on the bishop, which must move again, giving white a critical tempo. But Magnus does not play c3. He instead blocks with bishop to d2, which is not as good, and probably losing, since it does not gain a tempo and allows black to just trade off his bishop and then go on his merry way. But Jeffrey plays bishop to e6, allowing Magnus to initiate the trade when after knight takes b4, he could again play c3 with tempo, hitting the knight this time. But he plays c3, which is not nearly as good as it leaves him with a hideously hampered bishop on d2, hemmed in by his fellow comrades on c3 and e3. Jeffrey drops his attacked bishop back to d6, which is not best. Bishop to c5 was preferable, since here Magnus is able to trade off his knight with knight takes d6 check, unblocking his c-pawn, so that after queen takes d6, he can get in a quick c4, preparing bishop to c3. His queen now has some squares on the queen side, he can play bishop to e2, and just like that, Magnus is untangling himself. You give him an inch and he'll take a mile. Or maybe a better way to say it is, you give him a square, he'll take a file. Anyway, Jeffrey now castles long, and we do have bishop to c3. Now comes an inaccuracy with queen to c5. Looks kind of nice, uncovering an attack on the white queen, putting some pressure on c4, but after queen to a4, black's queen is not on a great square, since there's no good way to prevent it from just being driven back with the move b4. You could weaken your king side with a5, but after a3 from white, as Johnny23 would say, it's happening. A good move for black now would be to just admit defeat and play queen to e7, which is where the queen should have moved to begin with. But Jeffrey decides to spice things up with knight to g4, offering Magnus's pawn on e4, which he declines, seeing that knight takes e4 could be met with queen to f5, attacking both knight and pawn on f2. Now you could defend with queen to c2, but then knight takes f2 is possible anyway due to the fact that the knight is pinned to the queen and may not recapture. Taking with the queen, of course, drops the knight. The engine is saying that queen to g6, maintaining the tension, is even stronger though. Magnus has the good horse sense to avoid this awkward position, and in the game, he leaves his steed on g3 and just plays bishop to e2. He's now only one move away from getting castled on the king side, which is very often more than twice as good as being 2 moves away, or less than half as bad, however you want to look at it. Of course, taking the pawn on g7 would not have been very good, as that would allow black to activate his other rook with rook h to g8 with tempo on the bishop. You don't really want to go pawn hunting like that when you're behind in development. Now, best for black in this position is probably queen to g5. This prevents his knight from being kicked out at g4 with the move h3, since then black would have knight takes e3, followed by queen takes undefended knight on g3. What's played is the highly dubious f5, which actually gives Magnus a winning sequence now, beginning with b4, hitting the queen, which must now move backwards. Jeffrey puts her on e7, we have bishop takes g4, f takes g4, and now b5, driving the knight to a very sad square on b8. Now it's noteworthy that if Jeffrey had played queen to g5 earlier, as he should have, then the knight could go to e5 defended by the queen, or even to e7, both of which would have been much preferable to this b8 square. Magnus now castles, declining the pawn that is now up for grabs on a7. He knows that pawn's probably not going anywhere, since h6 would just allow him to open the file towards the black king, although that might be black's best move here. Jeffrey goes on the counter attack though with h5. Makes sense, he's planning to bite into the white king's defensive cover with h4 next. The engine still doesn't like knight takes e4 in view of bishop to f5 attacking the knight, followed by the bishop infiltrating the d3, hitting the rook. It prefers c5, offering black a pawn while threatening to push to c6 and planning to meet queen takes c5 with rook f to c1, getting the rook lined up on both queen and king, which is apparently worth a lot more than a pawn. But what Magnus plays is rook f to d1, a move which squanders most of his winning advantage, mainly due to the fact that it allows black to strike first with h4, driving the knight back to e2 and now g3. Magnus initiates a trade of rooks, and after queen takes d8, he plays rook to d1, another not good move, although it looks like the most natural thing you could play, putting the rook on an open file with an attack on the black queen, while preventing queen to d3, which would have attacked both knight and the pawn on c4, but a better way to prevent that move would have been with knight to f4, hitting the bishop on d3. The reason rook to d1 is not a great move is that the black queen didn't really want to stay on d8 anyway, and so after what's played in the game, g takes f2 check, king takes f2, rook to f8 check, and now knight to f4, if the queen were to now go to g5, then it would have greatly improved its position, threatening things like h3 or even an exchange sacrifice on f4, whereas the white rook isn't really doing all that much. But Jeffrey doesn't play his best move, queen to g5, he instead puts his queen on e7. This is a losing blunder, and one that Magnus is now able to punish very quickly. Pause the video if you'd like to try to spot the move that he plays. The move is bishop to b4, after which black will be losing the exchange. Now I'm assuming that Jeffrey just totally missed this, since after his response, rook takes f4 check, which is probably best, and e takes f4, although he does get to execute another check with e3. After king takes e3, it's pretty clear that black has nothing. His queen is still under attack, so there's no threat of a discovered check. But Magnus, for some reason, declines the pawn on e3 and instead plays king to g1, which is also fine and totally winning, although white does need to be a bit careful now, since after queen to f6 played by Jeffrey, it's very easy for him to go awry, and that's exactly what Magnus now does. What he should play is queen to c2, watching over the square in front of black's passed pawn on e3, but he instead decides to play queen to b3, attacking it directly. This gives Jeffrey the opportunity to push the pawn to e2, attacking the rook, which must now vacate the d-file, which means that after rook to e1, Jeffrey is now able to put his queen on d4 with check. And after king to h1, he's able to pick up the c-pawn with bishop takes c4, adding some defense to his now very dangerous passer on e2. And this looks very nice, but queen takes f4 actually would have been better, threatening mate in 2 beginning with queen to f1 check. What Magnus should play now is queen to f3, just defending f4, but he decides to go for queen to c3. Maybe he's hoping for a trade of queens. Jeffrey says no thank you, I think I'll go ahead and take on f4 now, threatening that mate in 2. Again, Magnus should play queen to f3, just blocking the black queen's access to f1, but he instead plays h3, giving his king a square on h2. And this is technically a blunder, although I almost don't want to even call it that, since black's single winning move here is, in my opinion, so far from obvious and so difficult to spot that if you can find it, you really should consider yourself a genius. And definitely let me know about it in the comments. Go ahead and take a moment, or take an hour, and see if you can spot the move. Black's only way to win is with a5, a multi-purpose move. One goal of which is to drive white's bishop from this diagonal where it's providing important defense to the rook on e1. This will keep white's queen tied down to its defense, since if it has no defense, black can just win with queen to f1 check, picking up the rook, unless white takes the queen, which will then be immediately replaced with a new queen. Now if white takes on a6 en passant, then knight takes a6, again hits the bishop. If it goes to a5, then there's b6, and its existence will not be maintained on this diagonal. Now you might be thinking, as I was, what's wrong with bishop takes a5 here? Well, this allows black to play b6 with a tempo-gaining attack on the bishop, which now must drop back to b4. Now it's black's turn to move again, except this time he's got the b7 square available for his king, giving him a winning sequence with queen to f1 check. The rook can't capture, black just gets a new queen. So after king to h2, we have bishop to d5, threatening checkmate on g2. Queen takes g7 is the only reasonable defense, but now comes queen to f4 check. And after the king moves, the queen takes the bishop on b4. And it's here that we get to see the importance of black having played the move b6, because without it, white would have queen to h8 check. And unlike in this position where the king can go to b7, black would have to play king to d7. And after rook takes pawn on e2, how's he saving his knight on b8? He's not, which means white will survive. And he's actually the favored side here. So how's that for a variation? Pretty crazy, huh? Let's get back to the realm of mortals though, shall we? Where in this position, Jeffrey unsurprisingly does not find the winning a5, but instead comes straight into f1 with check. And after king to h2, we have a repeat of the position with queen to f4 check, king to g1, and now bishop takes pawn on b5. At which point, Magnus Carlsen commits a severe blunder by willingly vacating this all-important diagonal with bishop to c5. Jeffrey says, cool, I'll put my queen back to f1 with check, and after king to h2, I'll throw in one more check, and after king to h1, I'll play knight to d7. Threatening knight takes c5 to draw the white queen away from her defense of the rook, when queen to f1 check would be game over. Magnus plays bishop to g1, makes sense, at least queen back to f1, now played by Jeffrey, isn't coming with check, which means Magnus can now grab the pawn on g7, adding defense to g2, which will be necessary if and when bishop to c6 is played. Now this does remove protection from the rook on e1, however, if queen takes rook, then white has queen to h8 check, forcing black to block with the knight, which is then picked up with check, driving black's king out into the open, where it will be endlessly checked, unless it makes its way to c6, when white actually has checkmate with queen to e6. A very pretty coordination of the queen and bishop. Jeffrey responds by playing b6, a good move, giving his king a square. Magnus executes a check anyway. We have king to b7. He grabs the pawn on h4, defending the rook. And here's another pop quiz for you. What would you play as black? The best move is knight to f6, just getting another piece into the attack, headed to d5. Since as long as black's bishop is sitting on this diagonal, white is never going to be able to capture the black queen, since the recapture with promotion will give black a new queen defended by the bishop. But Jeffrey plays what many of us would be tempted to play here, the inaccurate bishop to c6, threatening mate in 1 on g2. Magnus brings his queen into f2, defending, now actually threatening to capture black's queen, at which point the engine is giving dead equality. If black puts his bishop back on b5, once again preventing rook takes queen, then after king to h2 and knight to e5, somehow black's bind on the white position and his piece activity is exactly balanced out by white's slight material plus and his passed h-pawn, which can begin to advance. But Jeffrey does not play the absolutely essential bishop to b5. He instead plays bishop takes g2 check, which would have been a very good move if queen takes g2 did not come with check, since then black could pick up the rook on e1. But incredibly, both players apparently missed the fact that queen takes g2 would be check, and Magnus instead plays king to h2. Best for black now would be to take the pawn on h3, but instead we get a big blunder with knight to e5, which gets maximum points for craftiness, since if queen takes g2 check is played here, then there's knight to f3 check, king to h1, queen takes g2 check, king takes g2, and knight takes e1 check, giving black a winning position, since king to f2 can be met with a very lovely move, knight to f3, overloading the white king, who cannot stop the promotion of the pawn defended by the knight, while also preventing black from winning his bishop on g1. So a very cute variation. Let's see how Magnus wraps up this game though. After knight to e5, he finds the correct move, rook takes e2, now threatening to win the bishop on g2 as well as the knight on e5. Trading queens doesn't help, since after bishop takes f2, black still got the same problem. So what's tried is knight to f3 check, but after king to g3, Magnus is still threatening to win the bishop. If it moves this way, you lose the knight. If it moves this way, you lose the queen. So Jeffrey takes the bishop on g1, Magnus takes the bishop on g2 with check, forcing Jeffrey to play queen takes g2 check, and after rook takes g2, we have a resignation by Jeffrey Shong, seeing that his knight is trapped and will be won on the next move. So how's that for a masterclass in how to outgoat your opponent right out of his crushing opening position you've gifted him with the abysmal sodium attack? Don't try this at home, hiding behind your anonymouschess.com account. Save it for serious over-the-board tournament play, and then let us all know how it went in the comments. Or share any experience you've had playing terrible openings or having them played against you. Anyway, that's it for now. Thank you for watching. As always, don't forget to consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Leave a like if you like chess or if you own goats, and I will see you next time.